The Roman officer, Lucius, sat with a heavy sigh on a cold stone bench, the damp air of Britannia's northern frontier chilling him to the bone. Outside, the rain, an almost constant companion, whispered against the stone walls of the fort, a sound as endless as the forest beyond. In his hand, a newly sealed missive from Rome felt impossibly light, yet its words carried a weight far greater than the lead seal that secured it. It was an order, not a suggestion, a final decree from an empire that was beginning to feel less like a bastion of power and more like a collection of desperate, far-flung outposts. The legions were to withdraw, to fall back, leaving the distant, rainy lands of Britannia to fend for themselves. The decision, made in the distant halls of power, would unleash forces they could not possibly have foreseen, especially in the rugged, misty western lands known as Cambria to the Romans, or Cymru to its native peoples, a place we know today as Wales. As Lucius stared into the flickering firelight, he couldn't shake the sense of an ending, of a vast, sweeping change about to wash over this forgotten corner of the world. For 4 centuries, the Roman boot had been firmly planted here, a presence that, while often brutal, brought with it a fragile kind of peace and order. Now that order was about to dissolve. The tribes that had been subdued, the ancient Celtic ways that had been pushed to the fringes, would once again have room to breathe, to rise, and to clash. What happened when the empire that held everything together simply decided to let go? For centuries before the Romans came, the land of Wales was a patchwork of distinct Celtic tribes. They were fierce and at times ferociously independent, defined by their tribal loyalties and their deep connection to the land itself. We know a few of their names, whispered down through the histories written by their conquerors: the Silures in the southeast, a famously rebellious tribe who gave the Romans a proper headache; the Ordovices in the northwest, who preferred their mountain fastness to Roman rule; and the Demetei in the southwest. These weren't nations in the modern sense, but kinship groups, tied by blood, shared customs, and a common language that was the ancestor of modern Welsh. Their societies were structured around a warrior elite, with bards and druids holding positions of immense respect. Bards, in particular, were not just entertainers, but the living libraries of their people, memorizing epic tales, genealogies, and laws that passed from generation to generation. It was a world of oral tradition, where the spoken word held more weight than any dusty scroll. Then came the Romans. Their arrival was, of course, a shock. The legions, with their disciplined formations, their advanced engineering, and their unshakable belief in Roman superiority, were a new kind of force entirely. The conquest of what is now Wales was a messy, drawn-out affair. It was never fully complete either. The Romans might have built roads and forts, and even a few towns like the one at Caerwent, but they never truly tamed the mountains or the spirit of the Welsh people. The mountains themselves became a kind of refuge, a place where the old ways could survive, shielded by mist and treacherous passes. So for hundreds of years, you had this strange coexistence. Roman villas and military garrisons existed alongside native Celtic settlements. The Latin language, Roman gods, and Roman laws trickled in, but the Welsh language, the Celtic deities, and the ancient customs never disappeared. They simply adapted like moss on an ancient stone wall. When the Romans finally, definitively, decided to leave in the early 5th century, it wasn't a sudden, violent upheaval. There wasn't a single last Roman to pack his bags and turn off the lights. Instead, it was a slow, gradual fade. The central Roman authority weakened, and the legions were recalled to defend the heart of the empire from barbarian threats. The Romanized towns and villas fell into disuse. The roads, so carefully constructed, began to be reclaimed by nature, and the old Celtic ways, which had never truly gone away, began to re-emerge, like a forest growing back after a fire. Now, historians still argue whether the Romans left because they were defeated by internal rebellion, or simply because they ran out of resources to hold on to such a remote province. Whatever the reason, the departure created a power vacuum, a huge space left behind by the Roman machine. For the people of Wales, this wasn't a moment of liberation, but one of immense instability. Without the Roman military to keep a lid on things, old rivalries and conflicts, which had been simmering for centuries, began to boil over. The once Romanized elites, who had adopted Latin names and Roman customs, now found themselves adrift, having to rely on their own resources. The old tribal structures, which had been suppressed but never truly destroyed, resurfaced and reasserted themselves. The land was ready for a new chapter, but it was a chapter that would be written in the chaos and blood of petty kings and warring factions. The story of medieval Wales was about to begin, not with a bang, but with the quiet sound of Roman footsteps fading into the mists of history. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're listening, maybe post in the comments where you are and what time it is for you. As the Roman legions marched away, leaving their once sturdy forts to the mercy of moss and time, the people of Wales found themselves in a period that historians sometimes call the Age of the Saints, but could just as easily be called the Age of the Petty Kings. The order that Rome had imposed, however loosely, had vanished. In its place, a landscape of competing, often warring kingdoms emerged from the old tribal territories. This wasn't a sudden, grand unification, but a fracturing. The land broke apart into smaller realms, each ruled by a chieftain or a king who claimed descent from ancient heroes or a particularly impressive lineage. It was a time of immense political fluidity, where a kingdom could rise and fall in the span of a single generation. The most powerful of these kingdoms was Gwynedd in the mountainous northwest. Protected by natural defenses of steep valleys and rugged peaks, it became a stronghold of Welsh culture and resistance. To the east, bordering the Anglo-Saxon lands, was Powys. Its history was one of constant struggle and border skirmishes, a perpetual tug-of-war with its more numerous and aggressive neighbors. In the southwest, there was Deheubarth, a kingdom that would in time become a major player, and in the southeast, kingdoms like Llywelyn and Gwent carved out their own domains. Each of these realms had its own ruling dynasty, its own court, and its own set of problems. Life in these small kingdoms was a complex blend of warfare, feasting, and the meticulous recitation of genealogies. A king's power was often measured not just by the lands he controlled, but by the loyalty of his warriors and the generosity of his court. Bards, those keepers of history and myth, played a crucial role, singing praises of their patrons' glorious victories and ensuring their names would be remembered. Of course, a king's legacy wasn't just built on feasts and songs, it was built on constant raiding and retaliating against his neighbors. A quick raid on a rival's cattle was a common way to both demonstrate strength and replenish the larder. It was an intricate, often brutal dance of alliances and betrayals. The stories from this period are a fascinating mix of myth and history. One of the most famous figures to emerge from this era is a man we know as Gwynedd Wledig. He is said to have been a chieftain from the Old North, a Welsh-speaking region of what is now northern England and southern Scotland. The traditional tale says he was a powerful leader who migrated south to Wales to drive out Irish raiders who had taken advantage of the Roman withdrawal. His descendants would go on to found the long-lived dynasty of Gwynedd. Now, historians are still arguing whether Gwynedd was a real person or a composite hero meant to give the new ruling dynasty a heroic origin story. The truth, as is so often the case, is probably somewhere in the middle. His story, however, perfectly captures the chaos and migration that defined this period. The Irish Sea was not a barrier, but a highway, and raiders from Ireland posed a constant threat to the western coasts. These raiders established their own settlements, and it took a concerted effort by the native Welsh to push them back. The kings of this era were often known by epithets that told you everything you needed to know about them. There was Ceredig ap Gwynedd, after whom the kingdom of Ceredigion was named, and who was said to be a fierce warrior. There was Mercian ap Tybian, and so on. Their names were a litany of son of, a testament to the importance of lineage. The politics were deeply personal. An insult, a slight, a broken oath, any of these could be a reason for war, and yet there was also a sense of shared Welshness. The bards, traveling from court to court, ensured that a common cultural heritage was maintained, a shared history of battles fought against the Anglo-Saxons to the east and the Irish to the west. They were a people with a common language and a common enemy, even if they couldn't always manage to get along with one another. It was a time of internal strife, but also of defining an identity against external pressures. These petty kingdoms were not just military and political entities. They were also the centers of a vibrant culture. The courts, small as they were places where poetry and music flourished. The kings were patrons of the arts, and a talented bard could earn a good living moving between different courts. The law, too, was becoming more formalized. While much was still based on ancient custom, the groundwork was being laid for a system of Welsh law that would centuries later be codified by Llywelyn. This legal system, known for its intricate rules and its emphasis on compensation over punishment, would become a defining feature of Welsh society. This era was a fascinating, often brutal, crucible. It was where the Welsh people, no longer Roman subjects, began to forge their own destiny. They were a people without a single, unified ruler, but they were a people with a clear and distinct identity. The story of medieval Wales is a story of a nation constantly trying to define and defend itself, and it begins here in the fragmented, often chaotic world of the petty kingdoms. With the petty kingdoms bickering amongst themselves, a different kind of power was quietly, almost imperceptibly, taking hold. This was the power of the cross. As the structures of the Roman Empire crumbled and the old tribal ways were reasserted, a new unifying force was spreading through the land: Christianity. This wasn't a sudden conversion, but a slow, organic process that had been underway for centuries. By the 5th and 6th centuries, often called the Age of the Saints, Wales was becoming a profoundly Christian land, but it was a Christianity with its own distinct Welsh flavor. This was not the hierarchical, Rome-centric church we might imagine today. Instead, Welsh Christianity was intensely monastic. It was a world of hermits and holy men who retreated to remote, often breathtakingly beautiful, corners of the country to pray and live a simple life. These men, who would later be known as saints, weren't necessarily canonized by a formal process. Their sainthood was an organic recognition by their communities of their piety, their wisdom, and the miracles they were said to perform. The most famous of these, of course, is Saint David, or Dewi Sant in Welsh, who became the patron saint of Wales. He established a monastery in a remote valley in Pembrokeshire, a place so isolated that legend says he made his monks pull the plow themselves, refusing to use oxen, to demonstrate their commitment to a life of hard labor and humility. The site of his monastery is now the magnificent St. David's Cathedral, a place of pilgrimage. For centuries, these monastic communities became the new centers of power, learning, and culture in a world without Roman administration. They weren't just places for prayer. They were economic hubs, farming the land and trading goods. They were also intellectual centers, where Latin was preserved and manuscripts were painstakingly copied. The monks, working in the quiet scriptoria of their stone monasteries, were the new keepers of history and the collective memory of the Welsh people. The monasteries preserved the genealogies of the kings, wrote the lives of the saints, and kept alive the classical learning that was being lost in other parts of Britain. It's a wonderful, slightly ironic thought. The very stories of the Welsh chieftains, who valued the oral tradition so highly, were being written down and preserved by monks in silent, drafty halls. The saints themselves were often from the ruling class, members of royal families who chose a life of piety over political power. Their influence was immense. They weren't just spiritual leaders, they were also mediators in political disputes and respected advisors to kings. Their monasteries, scattered across the land, created a network that, in a sense, unified Wales spiritually, even as the petty kingdoms remained politically divided. This spiritual unity provided a cultural glue that held the Welsh identity together in an age of constant upheaval. The lives of these saints, recorded in texts known as Vitae Sanctorum, are a mix of historical fact and delightful myth. There are stories of Sant Illtyd establishing a great school at Llaneltyd Fawr, a kind of early medieval university that attracted students from all over Britain and Ireland. There are tales of Saint Cadoc, a contemporary of King Arthur, if you believe in him, of course, who was so pious he could walk on water. And then there's the famous story of Saint David and the Synod of Brefi, where he was said to have preached with such power that the ground rose beneath his feet to form a hill, allowing everyone in the valley to hear his sermon. These stories, whether true or not, told the Welsh people who they were. They were a people blessed by God, a chosen people with their own unique spiritual destiny. While the Anglo-Saxons were consolidating their kingdoms to the east, often reverting to paganism before being reconverted by missionaries from Rome, the Welsh were steadfastly Christian. This difference in religion created a new and lasting divide, a profound cultural and ideological chasm between the two peoples. The Welsh saw themselves as the inheritors of the true, pure form of British Christianity, a lineage that bypassed the need for Roman authority. This religious distinction, along with language and history, would become a defining feature of the Welsh national identity, a bedrock of resilience against the constant pressure from the East. It's a key part of why the Welsh held on to their identity, even when their land was slowly being encroached upon. The monasteries weren't just islands of faith, they were fortresses of Welsh culture. While the Welsh kingdoms were busy establishing themselves and the saints were spreading their quiet gospel, a new, formidable power was rising to the east. The Anglo-Saxons, having carved out their own kingdoms from the ruins of Roman Britain, were no longer a disorganized collection of tribes. They were becoming a coherent and increasingly aggressive force. Their largest and most powerful kingdom in the 8th century was Mercia, a vast realm that dominated the English Midlands. The Welsh, nestled in their western mountains, found themselves in the path of Mercia's expansion. The defining moment of this period, and a testament to the growing pressure from the east, was the construction of a truly massive earthwork, Offa's Dyke. Ordered by King Offa of Mercia, a ruler so powerful he was sometimes called King of the English, this immense ditch and rampart stretched for over 150 miles, from the mouth of the River Dee in the north to the Severn estuary in the south. It wasn't a continuous wall like Hadrian's, but a series of linked fortifications and earthworks that followed the contours of the land. Its purpose was clear: to mark a definitive border between Mercia and the Welsh kingdoms. It was a line in the sand, or more accurately, a line in the earth. The Dyke was a declaration that the Welsh were no longer just a neighboring people, but a foreign power to be contained. The sheer scale of the project is a marvel. Imagine thousands of men digging with simple tools, moving tons of earth and rock over hilly terrain. It's a project that would be a challenge even today. The Dyke was not just a defensive barrier, it was an economic and political one. It controlled trade and movement, and it became a symbol of the permanent division between the two peoples. For the Welsh, it was a constant, physical reminder of their precarious position, hemmed in by a much larger and more unified kingdom. It's a key part of the Welsh identity even today, a reminder of their long history of resisting powerful neighbors. This period was one of constant skirmishing along the border. The Welsh kingdoms, though divided, would often unite in temporary alliances to raid or repel Mercian forces. These weren't grand, pitched battles with thousands of soldiers, but smaller, more frequent conflicts. They were a testament to the Welsh ability to use their difficult terrain to their advantage, ambushing Mercian armies in narrow passes or melting back into the mountains after a successful raid. One of the most famous episodes was the Battle of Rhuddlan in 796, where the Welsh were said to have suffered a devastating defeat. The battle is known to this day from the popular and mournful Welsh folk song, Morfa Rhuddlan. Despite these battles, the Welsh kingdoms managed to endure. They had no single unifying ruler, but they did have a shared culture, a common language, and a powerful enemy that kept them on their toes. The pressure from Mercia forced the Welsh to find new ways to cooperate, even if those alliances were fleeting. This shared struggle also reinforced their distinct identity. As the Anglo-Saxons pushed westward, they were defining not only their own borders, but also the very concept of Welshness, the state of being the people of Cymru, the people who were not English. Offa's Dyke, in a strange way, solidified this identity. It was a boundary line that both separated and defined. On one side, a new nation of Anglo-Saxons was forming. On the other, the ancient Celtic people of Wales were holding on, refusing to be absorbed. The Dyke was a physical manifestation of a cultural and historical divide, and while King Offa of Mercia may have built it to keep the Welsh out, he inadvertently created a lasting monument to their independence. It became a symbol of resilience, a line the Welsh were determined not to cross, a line they would fight to protect. The Welsh kingdoms, now firmly defined by Offa's Dyke to the east, soon found themselves facing a new threat from a different direction, the sea. From the late 8th century onwards, the longships of the Vikings began to appear on the horizon, not just for trade, but for plunder. These Norse raiders, or pagans, as the chroniclers of the time called them, were a terrifying new force. They were fast, they were brutal, and they struck without warning, targeting coastal monasteries and settlements that were rich with treasure and poorly defended. Wales, with its long and rugged coastline, was particularly vulnerable. The raids were not a single coordinated invasion, but a series of scattered, often devastating attacks. Monasteries, which had become the centers of wealth and learning, were prime targets. The Vikings sacked the monastery of St. David in 982, for instance, a particularly grievous blow not just to the church, but to the collective memory of the Welsh people. The chroniclers wrote of widespread slaughter and the burning of churches, a stark contrast to the often ritualized warfare of the Welsh petty kings. This new external pressure had a profound effect on Welsh politics. The constant threat forced the often squabbling Welsh rulers to set aside their differences, at least temporarily, and form alliances. They realized that a divided Wales was a defenseless Wales. These alliances, however, were often as fleeting as the Viking raids themselves. A king might tenally with a rival one day to fend off a Viking attack, only to be at war with him the next over a territorial dispute. The alliances were born of necessity, not of true unity. Interestingly, the Vikings weren't just raiders, they were also traders and eventually settlers. They established a few small settlements along the coast, most notably in the south around what is now Swansea and Cardiff. They brought with them new trade routes and new goods, introducing a different kind of commerce to the Welsh economy. While their raids were destructive, their presence also opened up Wales to a wider world, connecting it to a network of trade that stretched from Dublin to Constantinople. This interaction, however, was always fraught with tension. A Viking trading post could easily become a launching point for a raid inland. One of the more enduring impacts of the Viking Age was on the internal power dynamics of Wales. The raids, by their very nature, were a great leveler. A king who might be secure inland could lose everything in a single, well-timed attack on his coastal stronghold. This constant state of alert favored strong, decisive rulers who could mobilize their forces quickly and who were skilled in naval as well as land warfare. It also forced the Welsh to build more sophisticated defenses, moving from simple earthworks to more complex fortifications. The era of the simple open hall was slowly giving way to the age of the castle. Now, historians still argue about the true extent of the Viking impact on Welsh life. While they were a constant threat, Wales was never conquered by them in the way that parts of England and Ireland were. The mountains provided a natural refuge, and the Welsh kings, despite their squabbles, were surprisingly resilient. They were able to use the rugged landscape to their advantage, making it difficult for the Vikings to move inland and establish permanent control over large areas. The Welsh were not a soft target, and the Vikings, pragmatic as ever, often found it easier to raid the wealthier and flatter lands of England. So while the Vikings never created a lasting kingdom in Wales, their presence was a powerful force for change. They disrupted the old order, forced new alliances, and accelerated the development of a more militarized society. The age of the saints was giving way to the age of the warrior kings. The Vikings were a kind of medieval pressure cooker, forcing the disparate Welsh kingdoms to become stronger, more organized, and more resilient. The lessons learned during these raids would prove invaluable in the centuries to come, as the Welsh faced an even greater and more organized threat from the east. It was a chaotic and dangerous time, but in the midst of that chaos, the Welsh identity was being hardened and forged, like a blade in a fire. From the chaotic world of petty kings and Viking raids emerged a figure who, for a brief and glorious period, would do what no one before him had managed to do: unite a significant portion of Wales. His name was Rhodri Mawr, or Rhodri the Great, and he is a towering, almost legendary figure in Welsh history. His story, told through the often sparse chronicles of the time, is one of ambition, cunning, and a remarkable ability to see the bigger picture. Rhodri inherited the throne of Gwynedd in 844, a kingdom that was already powerful. But Rhodri wasn't content with just one realm. Through a series of strategic marriages and timely inheritances, he began to consolidate power. He married the daughter of the king of Powys, and when her brother died without an heir, Powys came under his control. Then, by what seems like sheer good fortune, or perhaps a bit of clever maneuvering, he also gained control of Sicilg, a kingdom in the south. For the first time, 3 of the major Welsh realms were united under a single king. He was not a king of all Wales, not yet, but he was as close as anyone had come. What made Rhodri truly the Great was not just his ability to unite kingdoms, but his skill in defending them. He was a master of diplomacy and a fierce warrior. He faced the dual threat that had plagued Wales for a century: the Vikings from the sea and the Anglo-Saxons from the east. In 856, he won a major victory against the Vikings, killing their leader, Gorm. This victory made him a hero and cemented his reputation as a great protector of his people. He followed this up with another victory in 877, this time against an Anglo-Saxon army led by a Mercian king. He was a ruler who could not only bring people together, but could also keep them safe. Rhodri's reign was a golden age for Wales, a short-lived but powerful moment of unity and strength. He brought a level of stability that the country hadn't seen since the Roman withdrawal. He was a patron of the bards, and his court was a center of culture and learning. He was seen not just as a king, but as the embodiment of Welsh resilience, a symbol of hope in a world of constant threats. His success was a powerful argument for the benefits of unity. While the unity was personal, tied to him as a charismatic ruler, it proved that the Welsh people could, in fact, be a single, formidable force when they worked together. Sadly, this unity didn't last. After Rhodri's death in 878, his vast kingdom was divided among his sons. This was a classic Welsh problem. The system of inheritance, which often divided a kingdom among all male heirs, meant that the hard-won gains of a single ruler could be undone in a single generation. The unity of Wales, so carefully built by Rhodri, fractured back into the familiar pattern of competing kingdoms. His sons, while powerful in their own right, never achieved the same level of authority. Gwynedd, Powys, and Deheubarth once again became independent realms, often at odds with one another. Now, historians still argue whether Rhodri the Great's legacy was a success or a failure. On one hand, his united kingdom fell apart almost as soon as he died. On the other, he created a powerful, lasting memory of what was possible. He proved that a Welsh king could be a match for any Anglo-Saxon or Viking ruler. The idea of a unified Wales, of a single Welsh kingdom, was born in his reign. It became a kind of political ideal, a goal that future Welsh princes would strive to achieve. It was a golden memory that would inspire men like Llywelyn the Great centuries later. Rhodri's story is a reminder that even temporary unity can leave a lasting legacy. He showed the Welsh people what they could be, and in doing so, he set the stage for all the struggles, triumphs, and heartbreaks that were yet to come. While the descendants of Rhodri the Great were busy fighting over his fractured kingdom, a seismic event was about to shake the foundations of England and, by extension, change the course of Welsh history forever. On a misty morning in the autumn of 1066, a Norman duke named William landed on the coast of Sussex with a formidable army. He was there to claim the English throne, a claim he would soon make good on at the Battle of Hastings, where he defeated and killed the Anglo-Saxon king Harold Godwinson. This single decisive victory didn't just give William the crown, it fundamentally altered the political and social landscape of the entire island. The Norman conquest was a game changer. It replaced a fragmented, often internally quarreling, Anglo-Saxon monarchy with a single, powerful, and ruthlessly efficient new ruler. William and his followers were not just conquerors, they were master builders of a new kind of state. They built castles, not just as defensive structures, but as symbols of their power, solidifying their control over the newly conquered lands. They introduced a new feudal system, where land was granted in exchange for military service, creating a powerful class of loyal, land-owning barons who answered directly to the king. For the Welsh, this was a disaster waiting to happen. For centuries, their main enemy had been the Anglo-Saxons of Mercian and Wessex, a people they had a long history of fighting, raiding, and, on occasion, allying with. The Anglo-Saxons, for all their power, were never quite able to fully subjugate Wales. They had their own internal issues to deal with, and the Welsh mountains had always proven a difficult nut to crack. But the Normans were different. They were a more dynamic, more militarized, and more centralized force than anything the Welsh had ever encountered. They were a people who believed in total conquest and who were experts in the kind of slow, methodical expansion that the Welsh were ill-equipped to counter. William the Conqueror's initial focus was on consolidating his control over England, but he didn't forget about his new western neighbors. He didn't launch a full-scale invasion of Wales right away. Instead, he employed a more insidious and ultimately more effective strategy. He granted land to his most trusted and ambitious followers along the Welsh border, creating what would come to be known as the Marcher lordships. These new lords were given immense power and autonomy. They were, in effect, mini-kings, with the right to conquer Welsh territory and rule it as they saw fit, with little oversight from the English crown. This system was a brilliant, if brutal, solution for the Normans. It outsourced the messy, expensive, and dangerous business of conquering Wales to private enterprise. The Marcher lords, with their stone castles and their well-equipped knights, were motivated by a desire for land and power. They didn't need a king's command to invade. They did it because it was profitable. They would push into Wales, seize a valley or a hill, build a castle to secure it, and then move on to the next piece of territory. This was not a grand, unified conquest, but a slow, grinding process of attrition. The Welsh kingdoms, fractured as they were in a terrible position to resist this new onslaught. They would fight among themselves one day, only to have a Norman knight with a newly built Matta and Bailey castle appear on their borders the next. The Normans brought with them new military technology and a new way of fighting. Their knights, with their chainmail and their war horses, were a formidable force in open battle, and their castles, built to withstand a siege, were a new kind of threat. The Welsh, for all their bravery and their skill at guerrilla warfare, were facing an enemy with a seemingly endless supply of men, money, and ambition. The Norman conquest of England wasn't the end of Welsh independence, but it was most certainly the beginning of the end. The quiet pressure of the Anglo-Saxons had been replaced by a dynamic and relentless new foe. With the Norman conquest of England complete, the focus of the new Norman lords shifted westward. They didn't come as a single unified royal army, but as ambitious, land-hungry barons. They pushed into Wales, not as part of a grand strategic plan from the king, but as individuals carving out new territories for themselves. This piecemeal, yet relentless, expansion created a new political entity on the map, the Marcher lordships. The word march comes from an old term for a borderland, and these new lordships were exactly that, a fluid, often violent, frontier zone between Norman England and a still independent Wales. The Marcher lords were granted immense power by William the Conqueror. They were, in effect, semi-independent rulers in their own right. They had the right to build castles, raise armies, and wage war against the Welsh without seeking permission from the King of England. They had their own courts, their own laws, and they ruled their new territories with an iron fist. They were motivated by a mix of greed and a genuine desire to secure their holdings. For them, conquering a piece of Welsh territory was a way to enrich themselves and their families, to build a new life in a new land. The process of conquest was slow and methodical. A Norman lord would push into a Welsh valley, find a strategic hill, and build a motte and bailey castle, a simple but effective timber tower on a mound of earth surrounded by a wooden palisade. From this new base, they would then assert their authority over the surrounding Welsh population. The local Welsh prince, if he hadn't already been killed or driven out, would find himself a vassal of the new Norman lord. Over time, the motte and bailey castles were replaced by more permanent stone structures, monuments to Norman power, and a stark reminder of who was in charge. The castles became a dominant feature of the Welsh landscape, a new kind of symbol that was entirely foreign to the Welsh way of life. This process of Norman expansion was a constant, low-level conflict. It wasn't a single war with a clear winner and loser. It was a centuries-long struggle, a back and forth of raids, counter-raids, and sieges. The Welsh, for their part, were not passive victims. They fought back, often with a fierce and desperate bravery. They were masters of guerrilla warfare, using their knowledge of the mountainous terrain to ambush Norman knights and their heavily armored cavalry. They would attack the supply lines, harass the Norman garrisons, and sometimes even manage to capture or destroy a castle. The Welsh were tenacious, and the Normans, for all their military superiority, found that conquering Wales was a much harder task than conquering England. The Marcher lordships created a new kind of social and legal system in the borderlands. English common law was not in effect here. Instead, the lords ruled by a kind of feudal martial law. They were the law, and they could do as they pleased. This system led to a complicated and often brutal mix of Welsh and Norman customs. Welsh people in these lordships were often dispossessed of their lands and forced into a kind of serfdom. Their language and their customs were suppressed, and they lived under the shadow of a Norman lord in a Norman castle. The Welsh, who had managed to maintain their cultural identity for centuries, were now facing a new and more organized threat to their way of life. This slow, methodical encroachment, led by men with names like the Earls of Chester and Hereford, was far more damaging in the long run than any single Anglo-Saxon raid. It was a process of slow strangulation, and it was a direct result of the Norman conquest of England. As the Norman lords tightened their grip on the Welsh borderlands, resistance was inevitable. One of the most prominent figures to emerge from this era of defiance was Gruffudd ap Cynan, a man whose life reads like a medieval adventure novel. He was not just a Welsh prince. He was a claimant to the throne of Gwynedd, with a lineage that stretched back to the old rulers of the land. But Gruffudd's story was unusual, even for the time. He was born in Dublin, the son of a Welsh prince and a mother of Viking Irish descent. This mixed heritage gave him a unique perspective and a network of alliances that would prove crucial in his long struggle. Gruffudd's early life was a constant battle to reclaim his family's throne from rivals and increasingly from the Normans who sought to control Gwynedd. He was a master of the guerrilla war, a tactic the Welsh had perfected. He would strike from the mountains, harass Norman forces, and then disappear back into the mists. His fight was not a grand, unified war, but a persistent, low-level rebellion that wore down the Norman invaders. He was a symbol of the tenacious Welsh spirit, a leader who refused to be broken. One of the most famous and harrowing episodes of his life was his long captivity. Gruffudd was captured by the Normans and imprisoned in Chester Castle, a grim symbol of Norman power. He spent years in captivity, a living testament to the dangers of his struggle. But Gruffudd was not one to give up. In a feat of daring that sounds like it was ripped from a ballad, he managed to escape. His escape became a legend, a story of cunning and bravery that inspired his people and demoralized his enemies. He was a man who, against all odds, refused to stay down. Upon his escape, Gruffudd returned to Gwynedd and resumed his fight. He forged alliances with other Welsh princes, even some who had been his rivals, and with his old Viking Irish kinsmen. He used his connections in Dublin to secure a fleet of Viking longships, and he launched a series of raids on the coast, not just to plunder, but to keep the Normans off balance. He was a new kind of Welsh prince, one who understood that the sea was not just a highway for his enemies, but a potential source of power for himself. His campaign was a masterclass in asymmetric warfare, where a smaller, less equipped force uses its strengths, knowledge of the terrain, speed, and surprise to defeat a much larger enemy. Gruffudd's ultimate goal was not just to defeat the Normans, but to restore the pre-conquest Welsh identity. He was a patron of the bards, and he used their songs and stories to rally his people. He was a symbol of the old ways, the man who would restore Welsh honor and Welsh law. He was a king who fought not just for his throne, but for the soul of his nation. His life was a microcosm of the Welsh struggle against the Normans, a story of setbacks, of heroic comebacks, of cunning alliances, and of a deep, unshakable love for the land and its people. His long and eventful life, which ended in 1137, was a testament to his sheer will. He didn't completely drive the Normans from Wales, but he did secure Gwynedd, making it a powerful and independent kingdom. He built a stable dynasty that would, in the next generations, lay the groundwork for a more unified Wales. Gruffudd ap Cynan was not a man who was handed power. He had to fight for every inch of it. His life and his legacy became a beacon of Welsh resistance, a story that would be told for generations, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the Welsh spirit could not be broken. The legacy of Gruffudd ap Cynan was the most precious thing he could have left to his people, a stable, powerful kingdom. His son, Owain Gwynedd, inherited a realm that was not just a collection of contested territories, but a well-defined state. Owain would become one of the most successful Welsh rulers of the medieval period, a canny statesman and a formidable warrior who understood how to play the long game. His reign was a masterclass in diplomacy and strategic defense, a testament to what a unified Welsh kingdom could achieve. Owain came to power in a moment of great change. England, under the weak rule of King Stephen, was plunged into a period of civil war and anarchy known as the Anarchy. For Owain, this was not a disaster, but an opportunity. While the Norman and English barons were busy fighting each other, he had the space to consolidate his power. He didn't just defend his borders, he expanded them. He pushed the Normans back from the lands they had seized along the northern Welsh coast, reclaiming territory that had been lost for a generation. He took back important strongholds and solidified his control over Gwynedd, making it the dominant power in Wales. Owain's military victories were impressive, but his greatest strength was his political acumen. He understood that a straight-up fight against the full might of England was a losing proposition, so he used a mix of force and negotiation. He would launch a swift, decisive campaign to reclaim a piece of land, and then he would use that victory as leverage in negotiations with the English king. He was a master of the double cross, sometimes allying with one English faction against another, always looking out for the best interests of his own kingdom. He was a political pragmatist, not a romantic hero, and that pragmatism is what made him so effective. His reputation was such that even the English king Henry II, a powerful and formidable ruler, found him a difficult opponent. Henry II launched a massive invasion of Wales in 1157, determined to put Owain Gwynedd in his place. But Owain, using the classic Welsh strategy of guerrilla warfare, refused to give him a grand open battle. Instead, he harassed Henry's army in the narrow forested passes, cutting off their supply lines and picking them off one by one. Henry's army, bogged down and demoralized, was forced to retreat, a humiliating defeat for a king of his stature. Owain had proven that the Welsh mountains were a fortress, and that a determined Welsh prince was a match for the most powerful monarch in Europe. Owain Gwynedd's reign marked the high point of Welsh independence before the rise of Llywelyn the Great. He was a Tywysog, a prince of a different kind, one who was not just a tribal chieftain, but the ruler of a coherent and powerful state. He was a patron of the arts and a defender of Welsh law. The court of Gwynedd became a center of Welsh culture, where poets and bards celebrated his victories and sang the praises of his dynasty. He was a man who understood that a kingdom was not just a piece of land, but a political and cultural entity that needed to be nurtured and protected. When he died in 1170, the Welsh chroniclers recorded his passing with a profound sense of loss. He left behind a powerful kingdom, a legacy of resistance, and a dynasty that would go on to produce Llywelyn the Great, a prince who would take Owain's vision of a unified Wales to its ultimate conclusion. Owain Gwynedd proved that the Welsh could not only resist Norman aggression, but could also thrive and build a powerful kingdom in the shadow of their more numerous and richer neighbors. He was a beacon of hope in a dark and confusing world. Owain Gwynedd's death in 1170, so mourned by his people, plunged Wales back into its old habit of internal squabbling. His sons, instead of uniting to protect their father's powerful kingdom, immediately began to fight amongst themselves for control. This fratricidal conflict was a common curse of Welsh politics, a recurring theme that undid so many hard-won gains. But from this period of turmoil, a new leader would emerge, a man who would not just restore the power of Gwynedd, but would take its influence to a new, unprecedented level. This man was Llywelyn ab Iorwerth, a prince who would be known to history as Llywelyn the Great. Llywelyn's early life was a struggle. He was not the eldest or the most obvious heir to the throne. He had to fight his uncles and cousins to secure his rightful place. It was a difficult, often brutal process, but it forged him into a shrewd, determined, and patient leader. By the time he had consolidated his power over Gwynedd, he had learned valuable lessons about the dangers of internal division and the necessity of strong, unified rule. He had seen firsthand how quickly a powerful kingdom could crumble if its leaders were more interested in fighting each other than in fighting their enemies. Llywelyn's genius was in his ability to look beyond the borders of Gwynedd. He didn't just want to be the most powerful prince in Wales. He wanted to be the sole prince of Wales. He began a slow, methodical campaign to unite the country, not just through military conquest, but through a clever mix of diplomacy, marriage alliances, and political pressure. He was a master negotiator, able to forge alliances with other Welsh princes and to play the English against themselves. He understood that the English King John, a notoriously weak and unreliable ruler, was a far less dangerous threat than a unified and determined Welsh nation. One of his most audacious diplomatic moves was his marriage to Joan, the illegitimate daughter of King John. This marriage, a brilliant piece of statecraft, gave Llywelyn a direct line to the English court and a level of legitimacy that no Welsh prince had ever possessed. It made him not just a chieftain from the mountains, but a man who was, in a very real sense, a part of the royal family of England. This relationship was often fraught with tension. John was not a man to be trusted, but it gave Llywelyn the space and the time he needed to expand his influence. Llywelyn's military campaigns were just as impressive. He took advantage of the weakness of the English crown and the conflicts between the English barons and their king to reclaim huge swaths of territory that had been lost to the Normans. He didn't just conquer these lands, he integrated them into his kingdom, bringing them under the protection of Welsh law and Welsh administration. He was not just a warrior, he was a nation builder. He established a court that was a model of medieval governance, with its own treasury, its own chancery, and its own legal system. He became a patron of Welsh culture and a defender of the Welsh language. He was, in every sense of the word, a true national leader. His greatest accomplishment was to force the English crown to formally recognize his supremacy over the other Welsh princes. In the Treaty of Worcester in 1218, he was acknowledged as Prince of North Wales, and later, by the Treaty of Montgomery in 1267, his grandson would be recognized as Prince of Wales. Llywelyn didn't live to see the formal title, but he laid the groundwork for it. He created a Welsh state that was, for the first time, a single political entity with a unified purpose. Llywelyn the Great was the culmination of everything that had come before, a man who took the legacy of Rhodri the Great and Owain Gwynedd and made it a reality. Even with the treaties and diplomatic triumphs of Llywelyn the Great, the relationship between Wales and England remained fragile. The English crown under King Henry III never fully accepted Llywelyn's supremacy, and the tensions simmered just beneath the surface. It was a period of uneasy peace, a calm before the storm. When Llywelyn the Great died in 1240, the carefully constructed edifice of his unified Wales began to show cracks. His son, Dafydd ap Llywelyn, inherited the mantle, but he lacked his father's political genius, and a number of Welsh princes, freed from Llywelyn's iron grip, began to chafe against the new order. The old rivalries were reasserted, and the Marcher lords, sensing weakness, began to push back. The situation worsened dramatically with the rise of Edward the Certes to the English throne in 1272. Edward was a different kind of king. He was a ruthless, ambitious, and highly organized military commander, a man with a clear vision of what he wanted England to be. His goal was not just to contain Wales, but to conquer and absorb it once and for all. He saw the Welsh as a constant source of instability and a barrier to his grand vision of a unified island. Edward, a man of law and order, was also a master of using legalistic arguments to justify his conquests. He saw the Welsh princes, even Llywelyn's descendants, as rebellious vassals, not as independent rulers. The final confrontation was triggered by a series of events, a classic breakdown of medieval diplomacy. Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, the last prince of an independent Wales and Llywelyn the Great's grandson, refused to pay homage to Edward, a symbolic act that would have acknowledged Edward's feudal superiority. He also made a powerful political statement by marrying Eleanor de Montfort, a member of a noble family that had been a thorn in Edward's side. Edward, a man who did not tolerate slights, saw this as an act of open defiance. He decided it was time to put an end to the Welsh problem. Edward launched a full-scale invasion of Wales in 1277, a campaign that was a new kind of military operation entirely. This was not a quick raid or a seasonal skirmish. It was a massive, well-organized invasion using a combined force of land and sea armies. Edward's military genius was on full display. He moved methodically, building a series of new, formidable stone castles, not in the old Norman Motte and Bailey style, but in a new concentric ring design that was almost impossible to breach. He built these castles in a ring around the Welsh strongholds, slowly strangling the Welsh resistance. These castles, at places like Caernarfon, Conwy, and Harlech, were not just military bases. They were symbols of his permanent conquest. They were designed to dominate the landscape and to intimidate the Welsh population. The Welsh, led by Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, fought bravely, but they were outmatched. They were a smaller, less equipped army facing the full military and economic might of England. They could fight a war of attrition, but they could not win a siege. The war was brutal and short. Llywelyn ap Gruffudd was killed in a skirmish in 1282, his head sent to London as a gruesome trophy. His death marked the end of an era. The last true Prince of Wales was gone. The final act of conquest was the Statute of Rhuddlan in 1284. It was a legal document that formally annexed Wales into England. The statute abolished the Welsh laws of succession for Welsh princes, ended their independence, and established English administration over the conquered lands. It wasn't just a military victory, it was a legal and political one. Wales was no longer a collection of independent kingdoms. It was a principality under the English crown. The Statute of Rhuddlan was a turning point, the moment when the long, slow, grinding process of conquest was made official. It was the end of a long, difficult, and glorious chapter in Welsh history. With the Statute of Rhuddlan, the English crown had legally and administratively taken control of Wales, but they couldn't simply erase centuries of history and tradition. The Welsh, now officially subjects of the English king, still held onto their unique identity, and one of the most important aspects of that identity was their ancient legal system. This system, known as the Laws of Llywelyn was a point of profound cultural pride and a symbol of Welsh nationhood. These laws were named after Llywelyn the Good, a 10th century king who, inspired by Rhodri the Great, had also tried to unite Wales. It is said that Llywelyn convened a great council of jurists and scholars to codify the various laws and customs of Wales into a single, comprehensive legal code. The laws were not an invention of Llywelyn's, but a formalization of traditions that had been passed down for generations. The code covered everything from the rights of a woman to the price of a cat, offering a fascinating window into medieval Welsh society. What made the laws of Llywelyn so distinct was their emphasis on compensation rather than punishment. For many crimes, from theft to murder, the penalty was not imprisonment or execution, but a fine. The amount of the fine was meticulously calculated based on the value of the stolen goods or the social status of the victim. For example, the value of a man's thumb was a set amount, a cow was worth another, and the fines for crimes like insulting a king were astronomical. The legal system was based on a system of payments, known as galanas for murder, which aimed to prevent blood feuds by satisfying the family of the victim with a financial settlement. It was a pragmatic system that put a price on everything and everyone. The laws also reflected the values of a nomadic, agrarian society. They had intricate rules about the ownership of livestock, the division of land, and the inheritance of property. They were also remarkably progressive in some ways. For example, a woman had the right to own her own property and could divorce her husband under certain circumstances, a degree of autonomy that was rare in other parts of medieval Europe. The laws valued kinship and community, and disputes were often settled in public assemblies, where the community could weigh in on the verdict. The laws of Llywelyn were not just a legal code, they were a social contract. Even after the conquest, the Welsh held onto these laws with a fierce tenacity. They were a part of who they were. The English, under Edward I, tried to suppress the Welsh legal system and replace it with English and common law, a system based on different principles entirely. The Statute of Rhuddlan was a legal instrument to enforce this change, but it was a long, slow process. For centuries, Welsh people continued to live by their own laws, settled their own disputes, and preserved their own legal traditions, especially in the more remote parts of the country. The laws were not just a curiosity, they were a source of ongoing tension and conflict. They were a symbol of Welsh defiance, a quiet, non-violent way of resisting English rule. The English kings saw the persistence of Welsh law as a sign of rebellion and a threat to their authority. The Welsh saw it as a matter of justice and a way of preserving their cultural identity. The struggle over law was, in its own way, just as important as the struggles over land and castles. The death of Llywelyn ap Gruffudd and the subsequent enactment of the Statute of Rhuddlan didn't mean that Welsh resistance had ended. It simply meant that the nature of the resistance had changed. For the next century, the Welsh people lived under the shadow of English rule, enduring the presence of Edward's formidable castles and the authority of English lords. The Welsh princes, those who were left, were now merely vassals of the English crown, their power greatly diminished. But the spirit of independence, like a fire smoldering under a pile of ash, was not extinguished. It was just waiting for the right person to blow on it. That person would arrive in the form of Owain Glyndŵr. But before we get to him, it's important to understand the world he was born into. Wales in the late 14th century was a place of deep-seated resentment and quiet frustration. The English were everywhere. They held the major castles, controlled the most fertile lands, and held all the most important positions of power. The Welsh gentry, who still owned some land and held a measure of local authority, felt increasingly marginalized. They were often passed over for positions in government and felt that English law, which was seen as foreign and unjust, was being imposed on them with little regard for their own traditions. The Statute of Rhuddlan had been the legal instrument of conquest, but the long-term impact was a slow, grinding process of cultural and economic suppression. The Welsh, who had always been a people with a powerful sense of their own identity, were now being told that their language, their laws, and their customs were inferior. The bards, the ancient keepers of Welsh history and identity, were seen as a threat by the English authorities, and their songs of old heroes and glorious battles were a form of subversion. The Welsh people, while not always openly rebelling, were a population under duress. The situation was like a tinderbox, and all it needed was a spark. That spark was Owain Glyndŵr. Born in the mid-1300s, Owain was not just a Welshman. He was a member of the Welsh gentry, with a lineage that connected him to the ancient princes of both Powys and Gwynedd. He was an educated man, having studied law in London, and had served in the English army, fighting in Scotland. He was, in other words, the perfect bridge between the two worlds, a Welshman who understood the English system from the inside out. He was a man of two cultures, and this gave him a unique perspective on the injustices his people were facing. The immediate cause of the rebellion was a personal dispute with an English neighbor, a powerful marcher lord named Reginald Grey. The dispute was over a piece of land, a small but important border territory. Grey, using his influence at the English court, managed to have the case ruled against Glyndwr. This was not just a legal setback, it was a profound personal insult. It showed Glyndwr and all of Wales that no matter how educated or well-connected a Welshman was, he would never get a fair shake under English law. The system was rigged against them. On September 16th, 1400, a day that would become a momentous date in Welsh history, Owain Glyndŵr was proclaimed Prince of Wales by a small group of his followers. The rebellion had begun, but it wasn't just about a land dispute. It was about everything that had been simmering for over a century: the loss of independence, the suppression of Welsh culture, and the feeling that the Welsh people were second-class citizens in their own country. Glyndwr's rebellion was not a new war. It was a renewal of an old one. The rebellion of Owain Glyndŵr began with a small group of followers, but it quickly snowballed, tapping into a deep well of Welsh discontent. Glyndwr was not just a disgruntled nobleman. He was a leader who understood the power of symbolism and the art of political theater. He was proclaimed Prince of Wales, a title that had been dormant for over a century, a deliberate and powerful claim to the legacy of Llywelyn the Great. His timing couldn't have been better. England was in the midst of its own political chaos. The king, Henry IV, had only recently usurped the throne from his cousin, Richard II, and his rule was far from secure. He had enemies both at home and abroad, and the last thing he needed was a full-scale rebellion in his newly conquered territory. Glyndwr's early campaigns were a mix of strategic genius and sheer audacity. He used guerrilla tactics to great effect, ambushing English forces, seizing castles, and melting back into the hills before a larger army could respond. He was a master of using the Welsh terrain to his advantage, and his knowledge of the land, something the English lacked, was his greatest weapon. The Welsh people, inspired by his bravery and his lineage, flocked to his banner. The bards, who had been silenced for so long, now had a new hero to sing about, and their songs spread the word of his victories, turning a local uprising into a national movement. The rebellion spread from the northeast of Wales to the south and the west. Glyndwr's forces captured important castles, like the powerful stronghold of Conwy, and even managed to take the town of Cardiff, a major Norman-built town in the south. The rebellion was no longer a small-scale skirmish. It was a full-blown war for independence. Glyndwr, with a series of stunning victories, was making it clear that Wales was not a conquered territory, but a nation fighting for its freedom. But Glyndwr was more than just a military leader. He was a statesman. He began to lay the groundwork for a new Welsh state. He held a parliament at Machynlleth in 1404, where he was formally crowned Prince of Wales. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was a real act of nation-building. At this parliament, he outlined his vision for a free Wales, an independent Welsh church, 2 universities, and a return to Welsh law and customs. It was a clear, concise, and compelling vision that gave the rebellion a powerful purpose beyond mere military victory. He also understood the importance of foreign diplomacy. He sent envoys to France, Scotland, and Ireland, seeking support for his cause. He even formed an alliance with the powerful English nobleman Henry Percy, known as Hotspur, who was also rebelling against King Henry IV. This alliance, known as the Tripartite Indenture, envisioned a future where England would be divided between Henry IV's enemies. It was a sign of how seriously Glyndwr was being taken on the international stage. Glyndwr's rebellion reached its peak in the mid-1400s. He controlled most of Wales, and his name was a household word throughout Britain. He was a hero to the Welsh, a dangerous rebel to the English, and a fascinating figure to the rest of Europe. He had not just raised a banner of rebellion. He had raised a new nation. He was proving that the long history of Welsh resistance was not over. It was just waiting for the right leader to ignite it. In an Owain Glyndŵr, they had found that man. At the peak of his power, Owain Glyndŵr was not just a prince in name. He was the de facto ruler of a large portions of Wales. The years from 1404 to 1406 were the high point of his rebellion, a brief but glorious period when his vision of an independent Welsh state seemed not just possible, but probable. The English king Henry IV, beleaguered by his own problems, was struggling to contain the revolt. His attempts to invade Wales were repeatedly thwarted by Glyndwr's guerrilla tactics and the harsh Welsh weather, which seemed to be on the side of the rebels. One of Glyndwr's most significant achievements was the parliament he held in the town of Machynlleth in 1404. This was not a backroom meeting, but a formal assembly, attended by a number of Welsh nobles and key figures from his rebellion. At this parliament, Owain was formally crowned as the Prince of Wales. More importantly, he laid out his plans for the future of the nation, a clear and compelling vision that gave the rebellion a powerful ideological purpose. He spoke of an independent Welsh church, free from English control, and of a new Welsh legal system that would be based on the ancient laws of Llywelyn the Great. His most ambitious plan was for the creation of two Welsh universities, one in the north and one in the south, institutions that would not just educate the Welsh elite, but would also be a powerful statement of Welsh cultural identity and intellectual independence. This vision, so far ahead of its time, shows that Owain was not just a warrior, but a true statesman. During this period, Owain also managed to solidify his foreign alliances. His envoys secured a treaty with the French, an agreement that saw French knights and ships sent to aid the Welsh cause. This French support was a huge morale boost for the rebels and a significant problem for the English. It meant that Glyndwr's rebellion was no longer seen as a local uprising, but as a legitimate part of the wider conflict between France and England. He was also able to use his alliances with the rebellious Percy family in England to keep Henry IV's forces divided and distracted. He was playing a clever game of high-stakes diplomacy, and for a while, it seemed he was winning. Now, historians still argue whether Glyndwr ever truly had a chance of winning. Some say his cause was always doomed, that the sheer military and economic might of England was simply too great to overcome. Others argue that if the French had sent more support, or if the Percy rebellion had been more successful, things might have turned out very differently. But for a few glorious years, the Welsh people believed. They had a leader who embodied all the old prophecies of a coming Welsh hero, a man who seemed to be able to command both the loyalty of his people and the elements themselves. The rebellion was not just a military campaign, it was a cultural one. The bards, who had been silenced for so long, sang his praises and traveled the country, spreading his message of freedom and hope. The Welsh language, which had been under threat, experienced a revival as a new generations of poets and writers celebrated the heroic struggle. Glyndwr's rebellion wasn't just a political uprising, it was a spiritual and cultural one. It was a reaffirmation of Welsh identity in the face of centuries of suppression. But like so many Welsh movements, it was fragile, and it relied on the charisma and the vision of a single man. As the English crown began to regain its footing and consolidate its power, the high point of the rebellion would inevitably give way to a slow, painful decline. With the high point of his rebellion behind him, Owain Glyndŵr began a new chapter, one defined by the grinding reality of sustained conflict against a determined foe. King Henry IV of England, having finally secured his throne, turned his full attention to the Welsh uprising. He was a formidable opponent, a man who understood military strategy and who had the resources of the entire English kingdom at his disposal. He knew that he couldn't simply defeat Glyndwr's army in a single decisive battle. The Welsh would not give him that chance. Instead, he employed a long-term strategy of attrition and siege warfare. One of the most powerful symbols of Glyndwr's success was the capture of Harlech Castle in 1404. This was no small feat. Harlech was a masterpiece of English military engineering, a formidable stone fortress built on a high crag overlooking the sea. It was one of the jewels in the chain of castles that King Edward III had built to subdue Wales. Its capture was not just a military victory, it was a powerful piece of propaganda, a sign that the Welsh could in fact defeat the English at their own game. For Owain, holding Harlech was a crucial part of his claim to be the true Prince of Wales. He used it as his headquarters and his family's residence, a visible sign that he was in control of the country. But a captured castle is one thing, holding it is another. In 1408, the English army, under the command of the young and capable Prince Henry, the future Henry VII, began a series of sieges to take back the strongholds that Glyndwr had captured. The siege of Harlech was a long, painful affair. The castle was virtually impregnable from the sea and the land, but the English had a massive advantage in numbers and supplies. They built huge siege engines and slowly but surely began to starve the defenders out. Inside the castle, Owain's family, including his wife and daughters, were enduring the long, harsh siege, a testament to their commitment to the cause. The English strategy was simple and effective. They were not trying to storm the castles. They were simply waiting, cutting off all supplies and wearing the defenders down. The Welsh, for all their bravery, had no way to resupply their forces in the castles. The loss of Harlech was a devastating blow, not just militarily, but psychologically. When it finally fell in 1409, Owain's wife and daughters were captured and taken to the Tower of London. Their capture was a personal tragedy for Owain and a powerful symbol of the rebellion's decline. The loss of Harlech and other strongholds marked the beginning of the end. The rebellion, which had once been a single, unified force, began to fracture. The French aid, which had been so promising, was slow to arrive, and what did come was not enough to turn the tide. The English, in their methodical and relentless fashion, were beginning to regain control. Glyndwr, who had been a symbol of hope, was now becoming a symbol of a lost cause. The rebellion had peaked and was now on a slow, painful descent. With the fall of Harlech Castle and the capture of his family, the rebellion of Owain Glyndŵr began its long and painful decline. This was not a sudden collapse, but a slow, grinding process, a war of attrition that the Welsh, for all their bravery, could not possibly win. The English, under the command of the future King Henry VII, a man who had cut his teeth fighting the Welsh, were relentless. They adopted a scorched earth policy, destroying crops, burning villages, and systematically dismantling the infrastructure that supported the rebellion. The Welsh, now facing starvation and the loss of their homes, began to waver. The English also proved to be clever diplomats. They issued pardons, offering to forgive any Welshman who would abandon Glyndwr and return to the king's peace. For many of the Welsh gentry who had lost everything in the war, this was a difficult but tempting offer. Over time, many of them took it, leaving Glyndwr with a smaller and smaller core of committed followers. The rebellion, which had once seemed like a national movement, began to resemble a desperate last stand. Glyndwr himself became a more and more elusive figure. He was no longer a king holding court in a castle. He was a guerrilla leader on the run. The English chroniclers of the time wrote of him as a wily fox, a man who seemed to disappear into the mists of the mountains at will. He was still a threat, and there were still skirmishes and raids, but the grand vision of a united Welsh kingdom was slowly fading. His last recorded act was in 1412, when he was seen at a small gathering of his followers. After that, he simply vanished. The final years of Owain Glyndŵr are shrouded in mystery, and that mystery is what cemented his legend. The English crown never captured him, and he was never formally defeated. He just disappeared. His disappearance led to all sorts of legends, that he was living in disguise in the home of a loyal follower, that he had fled to Scotland or France, or that he was simply sleeping in a hidden cave, waiting for the call to return and lead his people to freedom. The story of his disappearance, more than any of his victories, made him a powerful symbol of Welsh hope and defiance. A hero who did not die, but simply faded into the mists of legend, waiting for his people to need him again. Now, historians still argue whether Owain Glyndwr's rebellion was a success or a failure. On one hand, he failed to secure Welsh independence. On the other hand, his rebellion had a profound and lasting impact on Welsh identity. He gave the Welsh people a new national hero, a figure who embodied all their hopes and their frustrations. He was a symbol of resistance in a world that had tried to make them surrender. The rebellion also forced the English crown to deal with the Welsh in a new way. For a while, they had to grant certain concessions, and they had to learn that the Welsh were not a people to be trifled with. The rebellion also had a long-term impact on the Welsh language and culture. The bards, who had been an integral part of the revolt, became more important than ever. Their songs and their poetry kept the memory of Glyndwr alive, ensuring that his story would be passed down from generation to generation. He was a man who failed in his ultimate goal, but who succeeded in a more important way. He gave his people a story, a memory, and a spirit of resistance that would endure for centuries. The story of Owain Glyndŵr is a reminder that a man can fail to win a war and still become an immortal legend. With the rebellion of Owain Glyndŵr now a part of history, the Welsh entered a long, quiet period of relative peace under the English crown. For over a century, there would be no major armed uprisings. The Welsh people, having endured a devastating war, were in no mood for another. They had seen firsthand the consequences of open rebellion. But while the fighting had stopped, the Welsh spirit of identity had not disappeared. It simply found new ways to express itself, and in the 16th century, a new dynasty would come to the English throne, one that, for the first time in centuries, had Welsh blood in its veins. This was the Tudor dynasty, and its founder was Henry VII. His grandfather, Owain Tudor, was a Welshman from the Isle of Anglesey, a distant relative of Owain Glyndŵr himself. Owain Tudor had married Catherine of Valois, the widow of the English King Henry VIII, a match that gave his family a tenuous but important link to the English throne. His grandson, Henry, would go on to defeat Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, a victory that brought an end to the brutal Wars of the Roses and ushered in the Tudor era. For the Welsh, this was a moment of profound significance. A Welshman, or at least a man with Welsh ancestry, was now the King of England. They flocked to his banner and fought for him, seeing his victory as a kind of final, quiet triumph over their old enemies. Henry VII's reign brought a new kind of relationship between Wales and England. He was a Welshman, and he was proud of it. He brought Welshmen into his court and made sure that his new government was seen as inclusive of his Welsh subjects. For the Welsh, this was the end of a long period of open hostility. It was a time of reconciliation, a chance to be a part of the British kingdom, not just as conquered subjects, but as partners. This period of relative peace and reconciliation would be followed by a series of legal acts that would once and for all formally integrate Wales into England. This was the work of Henry VIII, Henry VII's son. He was a larger-than-life figure, a king who was more interested in centralizing power and controlling his kingdom than he was in the old rivalries between the Welsh and the English. He saw the legal and administrative differences between the two countries as a source of inefficiency and potential instability. He wanted a single, unified kingdom with a single, unified legal system. This vision was codified in the Laws and Wales Acts, a series of legislative acts passed in 1536 and 1543. These acts were a complete overhaul of the legal and administrative relationship between the two countries. They officially abolished the old marcher lordships, those semi-independent territories that had been a source of so much conflict and instability. They replaced the Welsh legal system with English common law, and they formally integrated Wales into the English administrative system. Welsh people, for the first time, were given the same rights as English citizens, but they were also, for the first time, subject to the same laws and the same taxes. Now, historians still argue whether this was an act of conquest or an act of liberation. On one hand, the acts stripped the Welsh of their own laws and their own administrative system. On the other hand, they brought a new level of legal stability to the country, and they gave Welsh people a new sense of legal equality with their English neighbors. The laws also had a profound impact on the Welsh language. English was now the only language of the courts and the government, a legal change that would have a huge impact on the use and survival of the Welsh language for centuries to come. The Laws and Wales Acts of 1536 and 1543 formally integrated Wales into the Kingdom of England, but another of Henry VIII's great projects would have an even more profound and immediate impact on the country. This was the dissolution of the monasteries, a seismic event that shook the foundations of Welsh society and culture. Henry, in his break with the Roman Catholic Church, saw the monasteries not just as centers of a rival religious authority, but as immensely wealthy institutions whose lands and treasures could be used to fund his government and line the pockets of his supporters. For centuries, the monasteries of Wales had been more than just places of worship. They were the centers of the community, the largest landowners, and the providers of charity and hospitality. They were the keepers of Welsh history and the patrons of Welsh culture. Ancient monasteries, like Strata Florida and Valle Crucis, were not just religious houses, they were a central part of the Welsh identity. The monks, for all their piety, were also a powerful economic force. They farmed the land, bred livestock, and controlled vast estates. In a series of systematic moves, Henry's commissioners were sent to Wales to survey the monastic lands and to close down the houses. The process was swift and brutal. The monks and nuns were turned out, the lands were seized by the crown, and the valuable treasures, the gold and silver chalices, the decorated manuscripts, the religious relics, were either melted down or sold off. The buildings themselves were often stripped of their lead roofs and their valuable stone, a process that left many of them in the ruins we see today. The destruction was not just a religious act, it was an act of profound cultural vandalism. A huge part of the Welsh historical and spiritual landscape was simply erased. The dissolution also created a massive transfer of wealth and power. The monastic lands were sold off to a new class of gentry, many of whom were English or Welshmen who had embraced the new order. These new landowners, often more interested in profit than in piety, enclosed the land, displacing the tenants and changing the face of the Welsh countryside forever. This was not a gradual change, but a sudden, violent upheaval that reshaped the entire social structure of the country. Now, historians still argue whether the dissolution was a good or bad thing for Wales. On one hand, it brought a new class of landowners who were more interested in economic development and who, in some cases, introduced new farming methods. It also broke the power of a church that was seen by some as corrupt and out of touch. On the other hand, it led to the loss of a huge part of the Welsh cultural heritage. The monasteries had been the quiet guardians of the Welsh language and its literature. Their destruction was a major blow to a culture that had already been under siege for centuries. The dissolution of the monasteries was a quiet but profound end to a way of life that had been a part of Wales since the age of the saints. It was a clear sign that the old medieval world was gone forever. The land, once the source of so much conflict between the Welsh and the English, was now being transformed by a new force. The economic and religious policies of a powerful and absolute English monarch. The medieval chapter of Welsh history was now officially over, and the country was on the cusp of a new and very different era. With the dissolution of the monasteries and the formal integration of Wales into England, the country entered a period that was on the surface relatively calm. The old political and military struggles of the medieval era were over. But beneath the surface, a new kind of revolution was brewing, one that would completely transform the Welsh landscape and the Welsh way of life. This was the Industrial Revolution, and in Wales, it was fueled by two things: coal and iron. The change was slow at first, just a few small iron forges and a couple of scattered coal mines. But by the 18th century, it was a full-blown boom. The Welsh valleys, that's once quiet and rural, became a hub of industrial activity. In the south, the coal fields were discovered to be some of the richest and most accessible in the world. In the north, the copper mines of Anglesey became the largest in the world for a time. But it was in the south, in the valleys of Glamorgan and Monmouthshire, that the real transformation took place. The demand for coal and iron from the new factories and railways of England and the world was insatiable. Entrepreneurs, many of them English, descended on the valleys, building blast furnaces and sinking deep mine shafts. They created a new kind of community, the industrial village, a place where people lived and worked in the shadow of the coal tip. The old agrarian society was replaced by a new, urban one. People flocked from the countryside to the valleys, leaving their small farms and their rural way of life behind. The work was brutal and dangerous. Coal mining was a tough, backbreaking job, and the miners faced the constant threat of explosions, roof collapses, and black lung disease. The ironworks, with their roaring furnaces and their molten metal, were just as unforgiving. But for a Welshman who had been working as a tenant farmer, a job in the mine or the ironworks was a chance to earn a regular wage and to provide a better life for his family. The money was better, but the life was different. The ancient rhythms of rural life, the seasons, the harvests, the festivals, were replaced by the relentless 24-hour cycle of the factory and the mine. This rapid industrialization had a profound impact on Welsh culture and society. The old Welsh language, which had been spoken in every corner of the country, began to face new pressures. The English language was the language of the boss, the engineer, and the manager. The industrial towns were a melting pot of people from all over Britain, and English became the language of commerce and communication. The old Welsh way of life was in danger of being swallowed whole by this new industrial English-speaking world. But in a classic Welsh way, the people found a way to adapt and to hold on to their identity. The industrial towns, for all their grime and their dangers, also became centers of a new kind of Welsh culture. The chapels, which were at the heart of the nonconformist religious movement, became the social and cultural centers of the community. They were places where the Welsh language was spoken, where choirs practiced, and where a sense of community was forged. The Welsh miners, for all their hard work, were also known for their love of singing and poetry. The Industrial Revolution, in a strange twist, ended up strengthening the Welsh cultural identity, not by preserving the old ways, but by creating a new, modern one. The new industrial landscape of Wales, with its coal mines and ironworks, brought with it not just prosperity, but a new kind of social tension. The old feudal conflicts of the medieval era had been replaced by a new kind of class struggle, a battle between the working class and the wealthy, often absentee, landowners who profited from their labor. The Welsh, who had always had a strong sense of community, were now united by a shared experience of hardship and exploitation. This tension would eventually boil over in a series of dramatic and symbolic protests known as the Rebecca Riots. The riots, which took place in the mid-19th century, were not a rebellion in the traditional sense. They were a protest against a very specific and very unpopular kind of tax, the road tolls. In a time when the roads were essential for farmers to get their produce to market, these tolls were seen as a crushing and unfair burden. The system was corrupt, and the tolls were often exorbitant. The protests were also, in a wider sense, a reaction to a feeling of social and economic injustice. The Welsh farmers, many of whom were still living in poverty, felt that they were being squeezed from all sides by a system that favored the wealthy and the English. The name of the riots, Rebecca, comes from a passage in the Old Testament where Rebecca speaks of her descendants possessing the gate of those who hate them. The rioters, many of whom were devout chapel-goers, saw themselves as the children of Rebecca, and the toll gates were the gates they had to destroy. The rioters themselves, however, were not the violent, disorganized mob you might imagine. They were a highly organized group of men who, in a theatrical and surprisingly peaceful way, would go out at night dressed in women's clothes and with their faces blackened by soot. They would then, with a great sense of ceremony, smash the toll gates to pieces. The women's clothing was a key part of the protest, a way to symbolize their rejection of the old, male-dominated power structures and to make it harder for the authorities to identify them. The authorities, for their part, were baffled. They couldn't understand why these men were dressing as women, and they were often hesitant to use force against them. The Rebecca riots were a form of non-violent, symbolic protest that was both highly effective and deeply rooted in Welsh culture. The rioters were not trying to overthrow the government. They were simply trying to change a system that they saw as unfair. They were a protest, not a revolution. The riots eventually led to a government inquiry and the eventual reform of the toll system. They were a huge success for the Welsh people, a testament to their ability to organize and to fight for their rights. They were also a clear sign that the Welsh people, though now a part of the English kingdom, were not a people who would simply accept injustice without a fight. The Rebecca riots were a new kind of Welsh rebellion, a protest that was more about social and economic justice than it was about military conquest. They were a reflection of a new, modern Wales, a Wales that was learning to fight its battles in the court of public opinion, not on the battlefield. Amidst the great social and economic changes brought on by the Industrial Revolution, a new threat emerged, not from English armies or new taxes, but from within. The Welsh language, the ancient tongue that had been spoken in Wales for thousands of years, was in peril. The laws in Wales Acts of the Tudor period had made English the language of the law and government, but the rapid industrialization of the 19th century was now making English the language of work and commerce. The influx of English-speaking workers into the valleys and the new social structures of the industrial towns put immense pressure on the Welsh language, and many feared it would simply disappear. But the Welsh, with a resilience born of centuries of struggle, did not let their language go quietly. A powerful cultural and political movement began to emerge, not just to preserve the language, but to actively revive it. This movement, often called the Welsh Cultural Revival, was a broad-based effort that touched on every part of Welsh society. It was led by poets, writers, and politicians who understood that a nation without its language is a nation without its soul. They saw the language not just as a means of communication, but as the very heart of their identity, the vessel that carried their history, their myths, and their unique way of seeing the world. The revival was powered by a number of forces. The nonconformist chapels, which were at the center of community life in the industrial valleys, played a crucial role. They were places where the Welsh language was spoken, where sermons were delivered in Welsh, and where a new generation of Welsh poets and hymn writers were nurtured. The chapels became a kind of cultural fortress, a place where the language could thrive, even in the most English-dominated towns. The movement also found a powerful voice in a new generation of Welsh language newspapers and magazines. These publications, often run on a shoestring budget, were the lifeblood of the revival. They gave Welsh writers a platform, and they helped to connect Welsh-speaking communities all over the country. The newspapers were not just a source of information, they were a source of cultural pride and a way of creating a shared sense of Welsh identity. The writers and journalists who worked on them saw themselves as fighting a new kind of war, a war for the survival of their language. The revival also led to the creation of institutions dedicated to the preservation of Welsh culture. The National Eisteddfod of Wales, an ancient festival of poetry and music, was revived and became a national event, a showcase for the best of Welsh culture. The University of Wales was founded in 1893, a Welsh-speaking university that was a powerful symbol of Welsh intellectual and cultural independence. These institutions were not just academic, they were political statements, a clear sign that the Welsh people were not going to let their culture fade away. The struggle to save the Welsh language was a long, hard one, and it is a struggle that is still ongoing today. But the revival of the 19th and 20th centuries was a powerful and successful movement. It turned the tide against the slow, grinding pressure of English dominance and ensured that the Welsh language would survive. The story of the Welsh language is a story of incredible resilience, a testament to a people who understood that a nation is not just a piece of land, but a living, breathing culture that must be protected and nurtured. While the Welsh cultural revival was taking place in the chapels and the newspapers, a new, more profound change was happening on the ground, a change that would completely define the modern Welsh identity. This was the rise of the Welsh coal mining industry. The valleys of South Wales, once green and sleepy, were transformed into a vast, black industrial landscape. The coal itself wasn't just a commodity. It was the lifeblood of the nation, the very foundation of its economy and its society. For the men who worked in the mines, life was a constant struggle. They were a new kind of Welshman, not a farmer or a warrior, but a miner. They were a people of the darkness, working deep underground in cramped and dangerous conditions. The work was physically demanding and unforgiving. The air was thick with coal dust. The threat of a roof collapse was ever present, and the methane gas could, with a single spark, turn a mine into a fiery tomb. The miners, who would start their work as young boys, were part of a brotherhood, a community bound by shared hardship and a kind of black humor that only those who have faced death every day can understand. But the mines were also a place of community and culture. The miners, many of whom were Welsh speakers, brought their traditions with them. They formed choirs, celebrated the Eisteddfod, and found solace in the chapels that were at the heart of every mining village. The culture of the valleys was a unique and powerful blend of the old Welsh traditions and the new industrial way of life. It was a culture of resilience, of solidarity, and of a deep sense of community. The miners, For all their struggles, were a proud and self-reliant people. The coal industry also had a profound impact on the political landscape of Wales. The miners, living and working in close-knit communities, became a powerful and unified political force. They formed unions, fought for better working conditions, and became a key part of the British labor movement. The Welsh valleys, once a bastion of old-school conservatism, became a hotbed of socialist and communist thought. The miners, who had faced so much hardship, were now fighting for a better future, not just for themselves, but for their children. This was a new kind of Welsh identity, one that was not based on ancient history or royal lineage, but on a shared experience of work, struggle, and community. The miners, with their blackened faces and their strong backs, were the new heroes of Wales. Their songs, their stories, and their struggles became the new folklore of the nation. The coal mining industry was, in a very real sense, the crucible in which modern Wales was forged. However, the industry's boom wouldn't last forever. By the mid-20th century, the demand for coal began to decline, and the mines, one by one, began to close. The decline of the coal industry was a devastating blow to the Welsh valleys, leaving behind a legacy of unemployment, poverty, and a deep sense of loss. But the spirit of the miners, their solidarity, and their resilience would live on, and it would continue to shape the Welsh identity for generations to come. The industrial boom of the 19th century gave way to the economic downturn of the 20th. The two world wars, which the Welsh people participated in with great bravery, were followed by a period of economic decline. The coal industry, which had been the lifeblood of the nation, was in a slow and painful decline. The demand for coal was falling, and the mines, many of them now old and inefficient, were beginning to close. This decline had a profound impact on the Welsh psyche. A people who had been defined by their work were now facing a future of unemployment and uncertainty. In this atmosphere of economic hardship and social change, a new kind of political movement began to emerge. It was a movement that was not about old battles or ancient kingdoms, but about the future of Wales. This was the rise of Welsh nationalism. While a political party advocating for an independent Wales, Plaid Cymru, had existed since the 1920s, its influence was initially limited. The Labour Party, with its focus on the working class and social justice, was the dominant political force in Wales. But as the industrial landscape changed, so did the political landscape. The Welsh people, who had been fighting for their rights in the context of the United Kingdom, began to ask a more fundamental question. Did they need to be a part of the United Kingdom at all? The nationalist movement was driven by a new generation of Welsh people who were deeply concerned about the future of their language and their culture. They saw the decline of the coal industry not just as an economic disaster, but as a cultural one. They felt that the English government, with its focus on London and the southeast, was simply not paying attention to the unique needs of Wales. They argued that a Welsh-only government, with the power to make its own laws and its own economic policies, was the only way to protect the Welsh way of life. The political struggle was a long and difficult one. The idea of Welsh devolution, of a Welsh-only government, was a new and radical one. It was met with resistance, not just from the English government, but from many Welsh people themselves. They had a long history of being a part of the United Kingdom, and many of them feared that devolution would lead to economic instability and a loss of their British identity. But the movement, fueled by a new generation of activists, continued to grow. They used the power of protest and political action to force the issue onto the national agenda. In the 1960s, a series of protests and sit-ins brought attention to the issue of Welsh language rights. In the 1970s, a referendum on a Welsh assembly was held, but it was overwhelmingly defeated. The Welsh people, it seemed, were not yet ready for devolution. However, the idea did not die. The political landscape continued to change, and a new generations of politicians from all the major parties began to argue that a Welsh assembly was not a step towards independence, but a way to strengthen the United Kingdom by giving more power to its constituent parts. The long, slow struggle for Welsh political autonomy, which had its roots in the old battles of the medieval era, was now a central part of the modern political debate. The idea of a Welsh assembly, once a fringe political notion, gained momentum throughout the 20th century, particularly after the economic hardships of the post-industrial era. The Welsh people, having lost their old way of life, were looking for a new one, and for many, a government that was more responsive to their needs seemed like a good idea. This long struggle for political autonomy reached a turning point in the late 1990s when the newly elected Labour government in the UK, under Prime Minister Tony Blair, committed to holding a referendum on devolution for Wales. The referendum, held in 1997, was a nail-biter. The campaign was a passionate one, with both sides arguing their case with great fervor. Those in favor of the assembly argued that it was a way to bring power closer to the people, to give Wales a voice in its own affairs, and to ensure that the country's unique culture and economy were protected. They saw it as a way to right the historical wrongs of centuries of English rule and to create a new, more modern relationship with the rest of the United Kingdom. Those against the assembly argued that it would be an expensive and unnecessary layer of bureaucracy. They feared that it would lead to a complete separation from England and that it would create a two-tiered system of government that would be inefficient and confusing. They also argued that Wales, as a small country, could not afford to be economically independent, and that its best interests were served by remaining a part of the UK. The vote was a close one, with the Yes campaign winning by a razor-thin margin. The people of Wales, it seemed, had voted for a new beginning. The result was the Government of Wales Act 1998, a piece of legislation that created the National Assembly for Wales. It was a historic moment, the first time in over 700 years that Wales had its own democratically elected body. The Assembly, now known as the Senedd, was given the power to make its own laws in a number of key areas, including education, health, and agriculture. It was not a parliament in the same way as Westminster, and it did not have the power to make its own laws in every area, but it was a significant step towards greater autonomy. The establishment of the Welsh Assembly was a symbolic and practical victory for the nationalist movement. It was a clear sign that Wales was not just a part of England, but a nation in its own right, with its own unique identity and its own unique needs. The Senedd became a new center of political power in Wales, a place where Welsh politicians could debate and decide on the future of their country. It was a new kind of Welsh government, one that was not based on ancient lineage or military conquest, but on the principles of modern democracy. The long journey from the petty kingdoms of the Dark Ages to a modern democratic government was now complete. With the establishment of the National Assembly for Wales, the country entered a new phase, one of self-governance and renewed confidence. The long, winding road from the chaos of the post-Roman era to a modern democratic government had finally reached its destination. But the journey was far from over. Today, in the 21st century, Wales is a country with a clear and distinct identity, a culture that is both ancient and modern, and a place that is still finding its way in a world of complex political and economic relationships. Wales today is a country of contrasts. The old industrial landscape of the south, with its towering coal tips and its black-faced miners, is gone, but the legacy of that era remains. The old mining towns have been replaced by a new, more diverse economy, with a focus on tourism, technology, and a revitalized agricultural sector. The valleys, which were once the beating heart of a global industry, are now quiet, green spaces, a testament to the power of nature to reclaim what has been lost. The coal is gone, but the spirit of the miners, their songs, and their stories remains a key part of the national identity. The Welsh language, which was once in danger of disappearing, is now more vibrant than ever. It is spoken in schools, in government, and in the media. It is a language of modern life, not just of old traditions. The Welsh Assembly, in its role as a promoter of Welsh culture, has played a key part in this revival. The Senedd, with its bilingual debates and its Welsh language publications, is a powerful symbol of the language's resurgence. The Welsh people, it seems, have learned that their language is not a relic of the past, but a living, breathing part of their future. But for all its progress, Wales still faces a number of challenges. The old industrial towns are still struggling with unemployment and poverty, and the country as a whole has to find a way to balance its new, modern economy with the needs of its rural, agrarian past. The political relationship with the United Kingdom is also a source of ongoing debate. The Welsh Assembly has been given more powers over time, but the question of full independence, of a complete break from the UK, is still a topic of conversation. The Welsh, it seems, are still a people who are defining their own future, a future that is still being written. The story of modern Wales is a story of a people who have learned to live with their past while building a new future. They are a people who have survived the Roman legions, the Norman Knights, and the Industrial Revolution. They are a people who have held on to their language and their culture in the face of centuries of pressure. They are a people who have a powerful sense of who they are, a sense of identity that is deeply rooted in their history and their land. The story of medieval Wales, with its battles and its heroes, may be over, but its legacy is alive and well in the country we see today. The struggle for Welsh identity, so evident in the political landscape of modern Wales, is not a new phenomenon. It is a story that stretches back over 1,000 years, a long and often difficult history of resistance, resilience, and a stubborn refusal to be absorbed. The legacy of medieval Wales, with its heroic figures and its dramatic battles, is not just a dusty old story. It is a living, breathing part of the nation's soul. The people of Wales, even today, are shaped by the echoes of that long-ago struggle. The old heroes and the old stories are still a part of the Welsh psyche. The story of Owain Glyndŵr, for example, is more than just a historical account of a failed rebellion. It is a powerful myth, a symbol of hope and defiance. His name is a rallying cry for those who believe in an independent Wales, and his story is a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the Welsh have always fought for their freedom. He is a modern hero in a very real sense, a man whose legend continues to inspire a new generation of activists and politicians. The great princes of Wales, men like Llywelyn the Great and Owain Gwynedd, are also a part of this living legacy. Their reigns were a brief but glorious moment of Welsh independence, a time when a Welsh king could stand on an equal footing with the most powerful monarchs in Europe. Their story is a reminder of what was once possible, of a time when Wales was not just a conquered territory, but a powerful and unified kingdom in its own right. The idea of a Welsh prince, a ruler who is a part of the land and its people, is a powerful and enduring one. The physical landscape of Wales is also a testament to this legacy. The mighty castles of Edward I, which were built to subdue the Welsh, are now a central part of the country's identity. They are a constant, physical reminder of the long struggle against English rule, but they are also a source of pride. The Welsh people, who were once the conquered, are now the guardians of these magnificent fortresses. They have turned the symbols of their subjugation into the symbols of their freedom. The castles, once a testament to English power, are now a testament to Welsh resilience. The Welsh language itself is perhaps the most powerful legacy of all. It is a language that has survived centuries of suppression, a language that has outlived the Roman legions, the Norman knights, and the Industrial Revolution. It is a language that is still spoken in the homes and on the streets of Wales, a living link to the ancient Celtic world. The survival of the Welsh language is a testament to the stubborn and tenacious spirit of the Welsh people, a people who, in the words of an old poet, refused to let their language die. The story of medieval Wales is not just a chapter in a history book. It is a part of the nation's DNA. The struggles of the past have shaped the people of the present. They have given the Welsh a powerful sense of identity, a deep love of their land, and a fierce pride in their culture. The heroes of the past may be gone, but their spirit lives on, and their story continues to be told, not just in the history books, but in the songs, the poems, and the everyday lives of the people of Wales. The story of medieval Wales is the story of a people who never gave up, and who, in the end, won a victory that was more important than any battle, the victory of identity. The story of medieval Wales, with all its battles, heroes, and betrayals, is not a self-contained narrative. Its final legacy is not just in the historical record, but in the very fabric of the modern nation. The struggles of the past have a profound and lasting impact on the way Wales sees itself today. It's a country that is, in many ways, defined by its history, a history of a small people who refused to give up their identity in the face of immense pressure from a much larger and more powerful neighbor. The story of medieval Wales is not just a tale of conflict. It is a tale of a nation being forged in the crucible of that conflict. The long struggle for independence, which culminated in the rebellion of Owain Glyndŵr, gave the Welsh a powerful sense of unity and purpose. Before Glyndwr, the Welsh were often a collection of warring kingdoms, a people who, while sharing a language and a culture, were not always a single nation. But the rebellion, which was a true national uprising, gave them a new sense of a shared identity and a new national hero. The memory of Glyndwr, the last true Prince of Wales, has become a powerful symbol for those who seek to create an independent Wales today. He is a constant reminder that the Welsh were once a free people and that they could be again. The legacy of medieval Wales is also evident in the country's unique legal and political system. The laws of Llywelyn, which were suppressed by the English, are still a source of pride and a part of the Welsh legal tradition. They are a reminder that the Welsh had their own way of doing things, their own sense of justice, and their own set of values. The modern Welsh Assembly, with its unique set of powers and its focus on Welsh cultural preservation, is a kind of echo of that old tradition, a way of creating a new legal and political system that is uniquely Welsh. The Welsh language itself, which is thriving today, is a testament to this legacy. The language survived because the Welsh people, even when they were politically and militarily defeated, held on to their cultural identity. They understood that their language was more than just a means of communication. It was a link to their past, a vessel that carried their history and their identity. The struggle to save the language, which began in earnest in the 19th century, was a continuation of the same struggle for survival that the Welsh had been fighting for centuries. The stories of the medieval heroes, from Owain Gwynedd to Llywelyn the Great, are still told today, not just as historical accounts, but as a way of teaching the new generation about the country's past and its identity. They are a source of inspiration and a reminder that the Welsh have always been a people of great courage and resilience. The story of medieval Wales is the foundation of the modern nation. It is a story that has shaped the Welsh people, their culture, and their politics for centuries. It is a story that is not over yet. The final echoes of medieval Wales, with its long history of conflict and survival, can be felt in the country's modern-day resilience and cultural pride. This is a country that has been a battleground for centuries, a place where a small indigenous people fought to hold on to their identity in the face of immense pressure from all sides. But the story of medieval Wales is not just a story of defeat. It is a story of a long, slow, and ultimately successful campaign for survival. It is a story that has shaped the Welsh people and given them a unique and powerful sense of who they are. The political struggles of today, from the debates about devolution to the calls for full independence, are a continuation of the same struggles that the Welsh have been fighting for over 1,000 years. They are a search for a balance between being a part of the United Kingdom and being a nation in its own right. They are a modern echo of the old conflicts between the Welsh princes and the English kings. The Welsh, it seems, are still a people who are defining their own future, a future that is still being written. And so, the story of medieval Wales sinks into the realm of legend, a tale not of a final conquest, but of a continuous struggle for survival. It is a story that reminds us that a nation is not defined by its borders or its armies, but by its people, its culture, and its history. The heroes of the past may be gone, but their spirit lives on in the language that is still spoken, in the songs that are still sung, and in the pride that is still felt. The sun sets now on the ancient stones, and a quiet stillness settles over the valleys of Wales, a deep calm that holds the weight of centuries within its embrace. The last vestiges of a long day's light fade from the rugged peaks, leaving only the soft whisper of the wind through the tall, green grass. It is a peaceful land now, a land of deep history and quiet strength. The stories of kings and castles, of bards and battles, have all come to rest, their echoes fading like the final notes of a lullaby. The long journey is over, the tale is told, and the past can finally sleep.